Hi, I'm Paul J., and welcome to the Analysis.news. In just a few seconds, we'll be discussing the current negotiations going on to either get a ceasefire or perhaps some kind of peace. I put quotation marks around that because we'll see in whose interest the peace is. And we'll be back in just a few seconds with Denys Gorbach. So as the negotiations are getting going, mostly between the United States and Russia, and it seems very generous of them to include Ukraine in these discussions, because it seems like it's almost an afterthought what Ukraine wants, but it's even more an afterthought. I shouldn't even say an afterthought, it's a non-thought. What does the Ukrainian working class and people want out of these settlements? When Western media, and I suppose most media in the world, discusses the situation in Ukraine, you wouldn't know it's a class society. Of course, you wouldn't know it's a class society in the United States or Canada either, because it's almost never talked about. But today we're going to talk about Ukraine, and we're going to talk to someone who's been studying the Ukrainian working class, who is Ukrainian, now living in Sweden, but has a take on this, which we often don't hear, a progressive left take on what the Ukrainian people really want and need out of this moment. So now joining us is Denys Gorbach. He's a Ukrainian political scientist. He studies the working class and national populism in Ukraine. He earned his PhD in 2022, and he's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Lund University in Sweden. Thanks for joining us, Denys.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, just tell people the name of your book.
Yes, the book was published in 2024 by Foucault, and it's called The Making and Unmaking of Ukrainian Working Class.
Just let me say, I interviewed Denys in 2022, and we did a lot of 3 parts, I believe, where we talked about some of the current modern history, what happened in 2014, and we discussed a lot of the backstory to where we are now. Of course, a lot's happened since then, but we're going to start with the current moment, and then dig a little more into the history and also sort of, you could say, the balance of forces within Ukrainian society. So Denys, start with this. To the extent the Ukrainian working class can express itself as a class, which I expect is not all that much, and honestly, it's not all that much in a lot of countries, never mind a country that's been invaded. Let me just start by saying, because I know some progressives in North America don't come out and say this very explicitly, but let me say it explicitly. The Russian invasion, in my opinion, was a total violation of international law, the UN Charter, the conclusions of the Nuremberg trials that found wars of aggression the highest crime. And I think that's what we are dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not to say expansion of NATO wasn't a provocation, but it doesn't matter, provocation or no provocation, defending a sphere of influence is not justifiable under international law. So I just want to make that utterly clear from the beginning. And now I'm guessing you agree with me, Denys. If you don't, say so. Otherwise, let's talk about what the Ukrainian people, working class, want and need out of these negotiations.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Yes, that was probably a useful caveat in the beginning. It is indeed true that the working class is not really does not really figure prominently in all these discussions, which are mostly about geopolitics, international relations, and so on. If we put the simple question, what do the workers want? The answer would be just as simple, yes, they want peace. But then if we try to unpack what kind of peace does one think in fabrication, that might be a bit more complicated. So yes, in the very simplest terms, peace is indeed the term that is the word that everybody has on their mouth in these times. Everybody is extremely tired of the war. Morally, if not physically, I mean, those people who are still alive and not injured and so on. So that's already not so many. So peace in the simplest meaning of that is the cessation of hostilities. And this is true even to the extent that when Trump won the elections, but not yet became president of the US, there was, according to what people have been telling me, to what I was I was able to observe from afar, there was some kind of a renewed hope that finally it will somehow end. There is this saying in Russian and Ukrainian that a horrible end is better than a never-ending horror. But then, when Trump did actually assume presidential title and unfolded his vision of how peace should be actually concluded, that gave kind of a second thought to many people. Because as much as everybody wants people to stop getting killed in the front lines, people stop getting killed from missiles in their hometowns and so on, as much as that is true, the caveat about the stability of that peace is also not only something that you can hear among journalists or elite actors. So this is also something that is quite understood by so-called ordinary citizens, ordinary Ukrainians, working class people. So I can speak about the city that I happen to be a native of, and that also happens to be the native city of Zelensky by coincidence, which is called Kryvyi Rih in southeast of Ukraine. So the city has not been touched directly by the war in the sense that the front line is like 100 kilometers away from it yet. During the first 2 years of this ongoing war, the city has been relatively spared. The bombing that did take place during this first half of the war was more destructive, in fact, in Kiev, for example, in the capital, than in Kryvyi Rih. But during the last roughly year or so, there has been a systematic, like much more destructive bombing campaign of hotels and of other civil infrastructure objects. And so people, first of all, naturally don't like this situation. They're not big fans of such way of living, but also they are anxious about the front line of land hostilities creeping closer and closer to the place where they live. So the big fear is that today we sign peace on whatever conditions, and for that peace, frankly speaking, most people, in my opinion, would be completely, well, not completely, but would be fine with losing, in reality, the territories that have already been occupied. But this kind of sacrifice that they are ready to make is they want to get something in return, namely the guarantees that this war will not be reignited anytime soon. And so this is the big question. So yes, people want the war to end, peace or ceasefire, or name it whatever you want, because that's not the main preoccupation of the diplomatic framing, but the peace that would be stable. And that's a big question.
Do we have any sense of what the people who are living in the occupied territories want? Obviously, the Russian propaganda is such that the people who speak Russian want to be part of Russia, but that's wasn't really the history of Donbass and those areas. They originally wanted autonomy within Ukraine. They didn't want to be subject to a kind of right-wing rule from Kyiv. But at least before, if I understand it correctly, it wasn't that they wanted to be part of Russia. I mean, do we actually know what people want? And the thing I find a little peculiar from the Ukrainian side, unless I'm missing it, there's no demands for referendum, a UN supervised referendum, something where we actually find out what do people want, because it seems to me it should be more than a consideration.
From the point of view of the Ukrainian government, there's no need for referendum because they argue from their legal position. Yeah, from the point of view of international law, they have this sovereignty, and yes, they don't want their sovereignty to be challenged. From the point of view of radical democracy, whatever you might call it, sure. I mean, it's not a think crime for me to imagine a referendum, which would not be a mock referendum that Russia did hold in various territories that it occupied, but under completely transparent conditions with possibilities for all refugees to participate, sure, I mean, for me, it's fine. It's true that maybe it's not, you cannot probably, yes, hear it a lot from the Ukrainian side, because this would kind of undermine Ukrainian side's legitimacy from the outset. But yes, as a leftist activist from Ukraine, I personally don't have problems with that.
If they're going to accept a peace agreement that essentially allows the annexation of Donbass by Russia, they're giving up on the sovereignty argument anyway. Or they're not, but if they're not, it sounds like there isn't going to be an agreement.
That's where diplomatic framing comes in, because if we're speaking about peace in its full full legal term, that's impossible. I would bet almost any money on the impossibility of peace, strictly speaking, precisely because of that. Because politically, that would be well unthinkable for any Ukrainian government to sign the peace that would acknowledge Russian sovereignty even over Crimea, and much less over the territories conquered like lately. So what is in fact more, I mean, what they are discussing now, I'm pretty sure, with Trump and so on, is something more akin to the Korean scenario, where the war has never been concluded. There is still we have like 70-year or how many year long ceasefire without the necessity hence for South Korea to recognize officially the existence of North Korea and vice versa. So that is the realistic formula of, well, not peace, but ceasefire, but cessation of hostilities. That's why I was talking about that. And so that, yes, would allow Ukraine to preserve its kind of face, while in reality seizing, and that's the same thing with the Cyprus situation. If you're familiar with that, again, Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, does not acknowledge Northern Republic since 1974, since its inception. That does not, in fact, have big repercussions for everyday life. I was there. I visited this island a few times, so I mean, it's completely, I mean, you can cross the border almost as well as you might cross any other border. So but officially there is still this subtle difference, and Kosovo was the same thing. So this is what we're talking about now in terms of possibilities legally.
Yeah, so, but it winds up de facto being a Russian annexation of Donbass, and whether the Ukrainian government recognizes it or not, they're going to be having Russian identity papers, Russian passports, the schools will be Russian. In all likelihood, there won't be much of a Ukrainian language left. So, so as you say, the Ukrainian government gets this sort of save face. But it seems to me, this is why I started this interview by asking, what does the Ukrainian working class want? Like right from the very beginning, I don't know if you remember our last interview, but I always actually, and it's hard for someone sitting in a comfy Toronto to say anything about a people that have been invaded and are being slaughtered. And I have to say, I've always been almost as concerned about the slaughter of Russian workers as I have been about Ukrainian workers. There's no reason why Ukrainian and Russians should be killing each other like this. But we have to separate the Ukrainian oligarchy and Russian oligarchy and look at these things from a class point of view. And I actually never understood why some of the Ukrainian left kind of supported a conventional war in defense of Ukraine, meaning this. First of all, it was justified. Like in every respect, the Ukrainians have a right to fight any way the Ukrainians decide to fight. But it doesn't mean a conventional war was the right way to go. Like in Canada, Quebec, I believe, and in fact, even under Canadian law, Quebec has the right to self-determination. There's been referendums, and the independence movement has narrowly lost. But as a English-speaking Canadian, while I recognize the right of Quebec to separate, I really wish and hoped that they didn't, and I still, because I think Canada would be a far more right-wing country without a Quebec in it. And I think it's better for the working class of Quebec and all of Canada that Quebec's part of Canada. That doesn't mean they don't have a right to leave, but I don't think it's the best choice. And I felt somewhat similar about the invasion. Why fight a conventional war against the Russians when there could have been mass protests right from the beginning? There could have been general strikes. There ways not to empower the Ukrainian oligarchy and be dependent on the Americans. Now, maybe I'm dreaming in Technicolor, because certainly it never happened. But even now at this moment, shouldn't things, there needs to be a kind of discussion, doesn't there, about what's good for the Ukrainian working class and people, and not just hand whatever's left back to the oligarchs again.
Frankly, I don't find a lot of other options. I mean, given the situation in which you find yourself on the morning of the 24th February 22, I mean, what else do you have as a choice? You can either, I mean, so there is already a war. That is to say, you are already being kind of invaded and so on and so forth. And so yeah, you can either ignore it, well, so keep being invaded, or you can try to prevent it by whatever means possible. That is, yes, participate. I mean, take your turn and participate in the conventional war. So general strike, I mean, yeah, it's yeah, as an idea. Politically, I come personally from anarcho-syndicalist tradition, so I'm all for general strike as such. But it is a weapon against, like you said, against Ukrainian oligarchy or Ukrainian bourgeoisie, Ukrainian working ruling class, not against someone that, not against the foreign army that progresses through your territory. So here. So the real dilemma, as I can reconstruct it, is yes, are you ready to, are you going to fight, or are you going to sit at home and yeah, and just see what happens next?
Just to be clear, that's not listen, what I'm suggesting clearly wasn't possible, because that wasn't where the balance of forces were.
Mhm.
But I'm not suggesting staying at home. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
suggesting, imagine when the tanks are coming up the highway to Kyiv right from the
Mhm.
beginning. Hundreds of thousands of people sit down in front of those tanks. Millions of people protest against the Russian invasion, because the Russians were trying to claim there is no Ukraine. They're trying to claim that people wanted Russia to come in.
Mhm.
But anyway, that's maybe a little abstract at this point now, because it didn't happen, and I guess didn't happen for reasons of.
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, in fact, yeah. So that didn't happen in the very first hours and days, but in the first weeks that kind of took place. So there was sort of a natural experiment of that sort in cities occupied by the Russian army. Namely, I there were several such instances, but the clearest that I can remember is Kherson. So the regional center, regional capital that the Russians took very quickly. And for a while, mm, for several weeks, maybe a month, the first month of the occupation, the Russian army was, unlike those places around Kiev, in Kherson, they were more or less kind of cautious, at least publicly. They tolerated public protests against the occupying army, and public protests there were. So people did come like march along the central streets of the city, swearing at the soldiers that stood nearby and so on. So there was such a, I guess, something going along the lines that you have just suggested. But then, as soon as the general situation in the war allowed the occupying army, to behave more kind of freely, so they proceeded with their typical arsenal, that is, yes, riot police, and then all kinds of, yeah, unpleasant places like torture chambers activated and so on. another geographical point in Ukraine in that period of the beginning of the invasion was Kharkiv, so the northeast of Ukraine, which was not finally taken, but it was very telling how one of the groups of armored vehicles that were hit by a Ukrainian artillery missile turned out that the vehicle contained riot police and the tools that they use. So the anti-crowd dispersion stuff, all this. So not military, not equipment for the warfare, but the equipment for dispersing crowds violently within the city they already control. Which means that I would not really bet on the possibility of such, peaceful protests.
Oh, I'm not saying it has to be peaceful. I was about to make this point.
No.
There's nothing, I'm not in any way suggesting it shouldn't have been armed. I guess what I'm getting at and trying to bring it back to today, and I'm saying this acknowledging that it wasn't possible because of balance of forces, but the question of which class is going to lead the resistance. The oligarchs of Ukraine, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree, they did to some extent contribute to facilitating at least the excuse for this invasion, if not to some extent, allowing Russia to justify it to the Russian people, in the sense that the Ukrainian government could have taken the NATO issue right off the table. And I know there were Ukrainian voices prior and in the lead up to the invasion, academics, intellectuals, others saying, just declare neutrality, no NATO for Ukraine. Instead, the oligarchs didn't do that. The government didn't do that. And they put all their eggs in the American basket and wound up that the whole war becomes dependent on the US. And then, of course, we know what's happening now. You get a shift in what the Americans want, and then the Ukrainians are going to almost be watching this from the outside. And they're going to wind up with a settlement, by the sounds of it, that could have been had 3 years ago.
And frankly speaking, I would not even bet on this settlement being achieved even now with Trump very soon. Because for now it seems that to me it seems that neither party meaning Ukraine or Russia is actually willing or ready to stop fighting. Well, Russia is advancing, so there is no reason why Putin would want to stop advancing. Ukrainian elite also still believes that they can that they can somehow change the situation in their favor on the battlefield. So also they are not really that desperate to conclude this. So at this point, I think it's. But it's true that with the time that passes, Ukraine's negotiating positions probably risk getting worse and worse. That's true.
Trump seems absolutely overtly committed to this world is a world of big powers having a spheres of influence. And Russia's spheres of influence is based on how they assert it, more or less. And Eastern Ukraine is going to be theirs, and Western Ukraine is going to, quote unquote, be ours. And Trump is going to find a way to plunder the resources of Western Ukraine. I mean, overtly, that they've got this mineral deal they want, and that's just the beginning, because clearly they're going to try to bleed out of Western Ukraine everything they can, because America first, and Ukraine and everybody else way later.
This thing about minerals and so on, this is especially outrageous because the initiative, in fact, came from Ukraine. So this was a very clumsy attempt on the part of Zelensky's team to somehow ignite the interest of Trump for Ukraine. So when in December last year they see, okay, so there's going to be this power shift in Washington, D.C., What are we going to do about that? Yeah, so we know that Trump is kind of a businessman. He doesn't care about big ideas. He cares about money and similar things. So let's interest him in something material. So yeah, oh, rare earth minerals sounds exciting, sounds exotic. And then they didn't probably expect themselves that this idea reaches Trump, and he jumps on it, and, and then he starts actually demanding excruciating conditions. And currently, the same history is being repeated with nuclear power stations. Again, this, as far as I am aware, the initial idea came from Ukrainian side, and this was a way to convince the United States, let's have them on our side, at least for this big Zaporizhia power plant that's currently controlled by Russians. Let's have the US help us liberate at least that thingy by having them interested materially in it. And then better Americans taking some profit from that power plant than the Russians completely controlling it. But then, yes, now it's getting growing out of proportions. Trump already says that he has to control all the generating capacity, nuclear capacities of Ukraine and so on. So yes, it's bad diplomacy. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with you about NATO in the beginning.
Whether one thought NATO might protect Ukraine or not, it's almost irrelevant because Ukraine wasn't getting into NATO. It
Yeah,
wasn't
that's
going to
true.
happen.
Mhm.
It was all nonsense. Germany and France had made it clear that they kept using this word, it's an aspiration,
Yeah,
some
yeah.
phony way to acknowledge it
Mhm.
because they didn't want to give up NATO's right and supposedly Ukraine's right to be in
Mhm.
NATO. So they wouldn't technically acknowledge that. But the
Mhm.
truth of it is, they all knew Ukraine wasn't getting into NATO anytime soon. It was a ridiculous thing to put your
Mhm.
stake in the ground about. It
Mhm.
all started from, the Bush administration wanting, saying this, but Germans,
But
French, the Turks, I mean, I can't
mhm.
believe it would have actually happened. But it
Mhm.
becomes a very, it's not just symbolic, it's about you're offending the Russians' right to a sphere of influence. So if you believe in spheres of influence, which progressive people shouldn't buy into, but if you do, then you can say, okay, NATO is a threat to the Russian sphere of influence. Okay, take the damn thing off the table because it ain't happening anyway. But no, that wouldn't have
Mhm.
pleased the Americans. And this is where I come back to is that the Ukrainian
Mhm.
oligarchy and government put all their eggs in this American basket, please the Americans. And
Mhm.
of course, you wind up in a situation where now they can do whatever the hell they want to you,
Mhm.
including, selling you out on the peace agreement. But I must say, it's not like I'm arguing against the peace agreement. I'm very much for get the damn thing, get a ceasefire any bloody way possible, and then continue the struggle in other ways.
Yeah, and the eggs anyway were already had been in the same basket even before, so I would say
Well,
um,
then I come back to what shape is the Ukrainian working class in?
yeah.
It got any, what does it take to have a more independent, its own interests? Because there's different, obviously the big contradiction right now is between the Ukrainian people, the Russian invasion, but the contradiction in Ukrainian workers and Ukrainian oligarchy is still, very
Mhm.
much in operation here.
But yeah, of course. Yeah, so yes, so first things first, yes, just to make clear, because I read once in a while that the war is being waged exclusively by the ruling class, and it does not correspond, and I mean, defending Ukraine does not correspond to the interests of the Ukrainian working class. I don't understand how Ukrainian working class might not be interested in defending its livelihood. So that being said, of course, I will be the last person to affirm that Ukraine is no class is a homogeneous society and so on. So sure, especially starting from 22, in fact, the neoliberal offensive, it might be counterintuitive to many people, to me as well. It was a bit unexpected that during this war, the government has proceeded with actually the most um, intensive attack of neoliberal reforms against the labor law, against the protection of labor, so the industrial relations basically.
Hold on, let's get clear on that. So you're saying in spite of the need, you would think, for national unity,
Yeah.
and maybe a time where they would be less aggressive against working class rights, they actually were more aggressive. They used it
Yes.
as an opportunity to assert even more power over Ukrainian workers.
So yes, yeah, if we try to explain it, we might in fact refer to your compatriot Naomi Klein with her shock doctrine, because that seems like that, like the case of that. In the spring and summer of 22, when the Russian attack is like everywhere, Ukrainian parliament, pressed by the government, passes one after another 3 or 4 laws consistently deregulating industrial relations, allowing 0-hour contracts and so on, explaining that this is allegedly all in the interests of European integration, which it is not, because I mean 0-hour contracts are explicitly outlawed in the EU. In the European continent they only exist in Belarus and in the United Kingdom. So yes, there is this offensive that is not encountering any resistance, because it's difficult to mount resistance again given the circumstances. Martial law outlaws the public protests. Well, in reality, public protests do happen, but when, well, I mean, they are tolerated, but precisely if the government decides not to tolerate them, if they are contested, if it is an anti-governmental protest, then they might actually implement the martial law and disperse it. So, which means that if it was peacetime, for example, the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine, it's the largest one that exists in the country. It's not super militant, not militant at all. It's the legacy union structure from the Soviet Union. Just such a kind of a legislative attack, they would be able to respond by impressive mass mobilization. That's what happened in 2011 when they were raising pension age. So that's why I'm talking about that possibility. But yes, now the most that they can do and that they did was issuing a number of outraged appeals, saying that, yeah, you guys in the government, you are not really nice. You're not being nice to us. We should be all in this together. And yeah, besides that, the only thing that they can do is appealing to the international community, which is good, but I mean, it's not really working. I mean, it's not super efficient either.
Let me ask you, you said that early on in the interview that you thought most ordinary Ukrainians are ready for this to be over, ready for a settlement that's maybe doesn't recognize Russian annexation, but it de facto will live with it, to have it over with. But you also said that the Ukrainian government is not convinced that it has to be over. They still think they have a chance of what, gaining more territory back? I don't know. But what really is going on here is that the Ukrainian oligarchs and government are afraid of what comes next within Ukrainian society if there isn't a war. Meaning, you know, is there going to be some accountability for all this? Is the working class going perhaps to wake up and say, okay, now who the hell got us into this mess? Why did we lose hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people? For what? And you know, it's one of the reasons the Ukrainian government may not be in a hurry to settle this, because they're afraid of their own necks and what comes next. Or am I dreaming?
It is true that on the level, at least of representations of the discourse of popular imaginary, this is indeed a very recurrent motive, that like our guys should now come back from the front line and turn kind of their guns and their skills, their military skills newly acquired, against those in the high-placed cabinets in Kiev. So that is almost a commonplace. I mean, it's a very It's a very typical element of discourse, of popular discourse. Whether this is a real possibility, that I'm not sure. Because yes, Ukrainian workers do like to being very, braggish about how they are going to overturn every government and so on. In reality, the pragmatic possibilities, the mobilizational capacities are not the same as the desire to do that. But it is true that the continuation basically of the current situation with the war might objectively be in the interests of those who are currently holding power in Ukraine. That's true.
Because they also, I'm assuming, make money out of this. I mean, people get their taste of all these billions of dollars of arms sales back and forth, and I'm guessing there's members of the Ukrainian oligarchy that are doing quite okay in the midst of all this, and they're not the ones dying on the battlefield. As the same goes in every war the United States has waged, and then some.
Yes, I'm also trying to be careful not to overstate this, because yeah, it's also difficult to place yourself in their shoes. At what extent this ceases to be fun, and this becomes actually difficult to cling on to the power with this whole war situation. But well, at least, I mean, not being specialist on not being a political scientist in that sense, I can say from my relatively unenlightened perspective that the ongoing situation does play into the hands of Zelensky and his team in terms of conserving power, of preserving power in their hands. What happens after the war is less clear whether they will be able to cling on to their current positions or to cede them peacefully or less peacefully. And here actually we are coming to the typical post-Soviet power dilemma. Previously it was already manifest in Russia, it was manifest in Kazakhstan, in some other places, where once you construct an authoritarian regime, and currently, in fact, well, thanks to this war, Zelensky's regime is quite on the way towards becoming authoritarian, more than the previous ones, the previous presidencies. So once you construct this authoritarian regime in the post-Soviet space, at least, you have usually troubles securing ways of retreating. So there is a systematic lack of possibilities of undoing your domination peacefully. So you are either being like violently deposed, or you have to keep being this kind of dictator, because otherwise there's no way for you out of this.
I mean, people are going to say there was a deal like this available and discussed 3 years ago, and apparently there's the story as Boris Johnson came. I think there's negotiations going on in Turkey, and they scuttled the deal. I mean, once this thing is over, assuming we see the outlines of what this looks like, I would think people are going to say to Zelensky, what the hell did hundreds of thousands of people die for when you could have had this deal 3 years ago? Now, I do want to add one more thing, because I'm spending a lot of my time critiquing the Ukrainians, and I said something off the top, but I just kind of want to reassert it so there's no confusion. In my opinion, and I've looked at all the available evidence I can possibly look at, there was no imminent threat to Donbass. There was certainly no imminent threat to Russia. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine was an out and out war crime, period, full stop, under every single piece of international law. Let me add one thing, which everybody knows that's watching this, but I'll say it anyway. The door to this was opened by the American invasion of Iraq, which was an absolute war done under a pretext, as was this one. Nobody suffered consequences. Bush, Cheney were never prosecuted as war criminals, which they should have been, and Kofi Annan said this war was a war crime, but there were no consequences. President Obama had a legal responsibility to prosecute Bush, Cheney, and did not. In fact, rehabilitated them and actually teamed Bush up with Clinton on a special mission to Haiti, as if now the guy that invaded Iraq is now some humanitarian. I mean, the door to all this was opened up by the Americans, and the Russians look at that and say, hell, they got away with that. Why can't we? And it becomes a war of spheres of influence. This is not something, the realists like Mearsheimer, that a lot of people on the left want to quote. We don't need to accept that kind of world. That's bullshit. This is a world of inter-imperialist rivalry, and we're supposed to pick the horse we want to ride. That is not our job as progressive people. So having said all that, to get back to where we are, what is the state of the Ukrainian working class now? Is there the potential, let's say this agreement takes place, will there be a radicalization, or, and this takes me to another point, one of the supposed big objectives of the Russians was the denazification of Ukraine, which one, how about denazify Russia first and then talk about somewhere else, but set that aside. What has actually happened? Is the far right, Nazi-ish far right of Ukraine stronger or weaker now, 3 years later?
Okay, I have several answers to the. So first of all, just a quick note about the April 22 situation, because I feel it still remains a bit unclarified. So I mean, up to you to cut it.
I don't know either. I read mainstream press, and this is what people seem to say, and
so according to
it sounds like there could have been a deal, maybe.
So according to my best knowledge, what happened back then was Boris Johnson coming to Kiev, indeed talking to Zelensky, but it's not as if he said, "Yeah, I order you to keep fighting." It was more like Zelensky and his team asking the British, "Okay, so are we going to have guarantees if we sign this agreement now?" And he said, "No, you're not." And this is a different thing, right? So it means that if they, well, basically again, like today, the same dilemma. Either they sign and ceasefire is enacted, but then there are no guarantees, and that's not something that they would that they were willing to sign back then, and not something that they're willing to sign now. So it's different. I mean, it is about the West not willing to extend their guarantees. So that's a bit different light in which we can see that story. Having said that, the working class, if you ask about the potential for mobilization, to me it looks rather low. Well, before the war already, the working class, I mean, it was already legitimate to ask the question to what extent it exists, if we understand class in the sense of, not just category, not just a number of people working in such and such professions, but as a social tissue, social fabric consisting of associations, trade unions, horizontal, vertical links, and so on and so forth. So these links. So basically, this is my research. What I was pointing out in the book. Finally, that there is plenty of politics, obviously, going on in the working class milieu, but it is very ephemeral. For example, before the war, I was observing and then described a number of wildcat strikes. So a wildcat strike has its repertoire of actions. So it's very fascinating that people already know what to do, who does what, and so on. But then once the crisis is kind of solved, so the strike ended one way or another with a defeat or victory, all the structures are dissolved. Because if there is anything resembling more or less permanent social structures, political structures, this is suspicious in the eyes of post-Soviet workers, because to them this is what they call political, which is a bad word, which is associated with corruption, with treason, and so on and so forth. So there is this kind of self-defeating dynamics that I was describing for Ukrainian workers, which self-sabotage by refusing to organize in a more durable ways, because to them any durable organization would mean politicking in the bad sense of the word. So and then when the war comes, when the Russian invasion comes in 2022, there is this hope. Well, there is first of all this surprise that the workers also, against all that we could expect, we could have expected, in fact, do go and join the army and or join the forever volunteering efforts. So somehow this strikes the note, the right chord. This is so there is this mass spontaneous reaction, and this gives hope that what you're saying, that after the war, these structures will remain in place and will be now serving the political purposes of the working class. So self-organization, not against the foreign army, but against the local elite.
Let me say one thing, is that it's not like the Ukrainian working class lack of class consciousness, lack of organization is something unique. We're seeing that all over the world. Look at Canada, who's, these threats of tariffs, Trump, saying all these things about Canada should join the US and these big tariffs being hit. Where is the Canadian working class having any independent position? Well, nowhere. Everything's being expressed through the Liberal Party, Conservative Party, and the NDP, which is supposedly the Workers' Party, is going to get demolished in this election. And the same thing in the US. Where is there any really independent American working class position? The UAW, one of the more progressive unions, the Auto Workers Union, winds up supporting Trump's tariffs against Canada.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So, when I'm asking about the Ukrainian working class, let me say I'm in no way trying to be particularly critical about the Ukrainian working class. There's only one real big difference at the moment about the potential between the Ukrainian working class and many other countries, is that they're armed. All the Ukrainian workers have guns now, and that's not normal in a relatively advanced capitalist country. And the oligarchy, the ruling circles, the government, I would think when this is all, the dust clears, are going to be very discredited and have very little moral authority. But I do return to a question I asked, which is, it doesn't have to go in a left-wing direction. Meaning the Russians supposedly denazifying Ukraine have they actually strengthened the Nazis in the course of all of this?
So yes, so there are basically, yes, two fantasies about the armed working class. Either, yes, either they turn their weapons against the elites and so on. So it's this is the like Trotskyist fantasy, anarchist of course, and the opposite scenario is that this will mean. This will give a potential, what you're saying, for some kind of a right-wing coup or something like that. I would say that certainly not the first one, but probably the second one is also, luckily for now, I would say is not imminent. Let's say so. Let's put it that way, because yeah, you and I might discuss the way Zelensky is concentrating the power, and we might not like his authoritarian tendencies, sure, but it remains a fact that his popularity among the actual working class, the actual existing working class, is quite high. And Trump, if anything, made him more popular than ever with that recent exchange in Washington, D.C. Which means that the far right, the Nazis, sure, they do exist in Ukraine. They do participate in the war on Ukraine's side. There are also between between the brackets we can mention that part of Russian neo-Nazis who chose the Ukrainian side and who are now fighting side by side with the Ukrainian soldiers under the supervision of Ukrainian Secret Service. So I don't know what they're betting for. Either they just want both Russians and Ukrainian neo-Nazis just to fight all as much as they want, and with any luck they will die. At least many of them would. So that might be a calculation. I don't know, maybe there are more sinister calculations. I don't know about that. But the fact is that those of the far right who have actual political ambitions or potential political ambitions in Ukraine, currently it's hard for me to envision them staging some kind of a coup or challenging the current authorities, the authority of Zelensky, because they do possess, yes, they are trained, they are now being trained in weapons and so on and so forth, but politically, in terms of their popularity, in terms of the penetration of their messages, I mean, luckily, we are not there yet. So they remain marginal in the sense of, I mean, paradoxically, or maybe not paradoxically, they are much more popular within the Ukrainian intellectuals public sphere, among the journalists, the intellectuals, than among the actual people, like the masses, so to say, the workers.
Why is that?
Uh, well, historically, Ukrainian liberals were quite close to nationalists because of this history of subjugation and NATO, Russia. So already in this, it's a collaboration kind of between the two political traditions that spans the whole Soviet period. The composite verb national democrats does not probably make much sense in other contexts, but in Ukraine it means, yes, kind of good guys who are for democracy, but also that includes nationalists, which is not evident for everywhere, for other countries.
I was reading an analysis somewhere that says while the Nazi far-right forces are not necessarily stronger in any official political way, but Nazism, the Azov battalions and such, have become normalized, even somewhat heroic, because they have been fighting. And instead of denazifying Ukraine, this war has actually given them, in a weird way, more moral authority. Is that true?
The normalization, yes, unfortunately, it happened. This process started even before that, before 22, and yes, well, there was a big one big how do you say it, the critical juncture was the Mariupol siege, which I don't know why. To me it's just a sheer stupidity. The whole state propaganda machine decided to concentrate solely on Azov. Although there were also just as numerous or more numerous than them, there were Marines, there were other detachments that were not political, and I mean.
And there were, if I understand correctly, a lot of the left socialists joined the army and were also involved in that, no?
In the Nazi
In the
detachments?
fighting the Russians in Mariupol.
Oh, fighting in the army, yes. But yes, precisely. I mean, luckily the army still does not equal all those elite detachments with neo-Nazi political profile. So these are, I mean, I don't have the exact figures. It's like million people, I think now, Ukrainian army. So on that wide background, we're talking about what, thousands? I doubt it's even tens of thousands of the Nazis. So they are very prominent. It is and unfortunately, yes, now it is much more difficult, if not impossible, for example, to speak about Azov critically, because everybody just forgot what they were, like what they are politically, because now they are in the popular imagination only associated with the image of heroic defender of the motherland. So that is a problem. Their access to elite equipment and so on is probably a problem.
Well, look, we have lots more we can talk about. So let's organize another session, but let me just end with just one question. So what are you hoping for now?
Well, I'm with the workers, so I mean, yes, I'm also totally behind this demand of peace, that is cessation of hostilities, without, I mean, fighting for the 91 borders. I think that is something that everybody has already kind of accepted more or less in the depth of their heart, that that is not going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So cessation of hostilities with on more or less decent conditions. That is to say, guarantees that this will not start all over again tomorrow. So this is the best thing that I can wish for this country, because the endless war is not, I mean, it will end sooner or later, and better for it to end sooner than later, because with every day, mm, the economy, society pays a huge price. So that being said, I really wish that, I really hope that Europe now is able to come up with some kind of guarantees that we cannot expect anymore from the United States.
All right, thanks. And thank you all for joining us on theAnalysis.news. And don't forget, there's a donate button up there if you want more of this kind of content. We need you to support us. Bye-bye.